Imagine an emperor so narcissistic, so monumentally detached from reality, that he genuinely believed he was a living god, a divine being whose very essence was salvation for humanity. Picture this self-proclaimed deity, Commodus, heir to the sprawling Roman Empire, ultimately meeting his end not on a glorious battlefield, not through a noble sacrifice, but ignominiously tangled and strangled in a bathtub. An unspeakably undignified, almost pathetic demise for a man who envisioned himself transcending mortality. But his madness wasn't merely a personal affliction. It was a contagion that threatened to unravel the very fabric of Rome, pushing an empire at its zenith to the brink of chaos and self-destruction. What primal forces or psychological aberrations could possibly drive a man to such profound depths of delusion? How did a reign born from the lineage of Rome's most revered philosopher-king so swiftly devolve into a spectacle of tyranny and terror, ultimately paving the way for one of the empire's darkest chapters? To truly grasp the terrifying journey of Commodus, we must first immerse ourselves in the world he inherited, a world on the precipice of change. The late 2nd century ad. For nearly a century, Rome had flourished under the successive reigns of the 5 good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and finally Marcus Aurelius. These weren't mere rulers. They were statesmen, administrators, and, in Aurelius's case, a profound philosophical mind. Their combined rule represented a golden age characterized by rational governance, vast infrastructure projects, legal reforms, and a relative absence of internal strife. It was a period of calculated expansion and careful consolidation, where the mechanisms of empire functioned with a surprising degree of efficiency and foresight. The reins of power were typically passed down through meritocratic adoption rather than direct bloodline, a practice that for generations had ensured competent and dedicated leadership. Rome was a beacon of civilization, its intricate network of roads, aqueducts, and legal frameworks stretching from Britannia to Mesopotamia, embodying an almost mythical sense of order and permanence. However, beneath this veneer of imperial tranquility, subtle shifts were already beginning to stir. The very system that had guaranteed stability, the adoptive succession, was about to be broken. Marcus Aurelius, unlike his predecessors, chose to name his own son, Commodus, as his successor, a decision that would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. This singular choice, born perhaps of paternal affection or a misguided belief in his son's capabilities, would jettison Rome from its era of benevolent despotism into a harrowing descent. The transition from the enlightened rationality of a philosopher-emperor to the unhinged cruelty of a self-proclaimed god would not merely be a change of guard. It would be a fundamental reordering of Rome's moral and political landscape. The stage was set. The Pax Romana, while brilliant, was also a fragile construct dependent on the wisdom and restraint of its leaders. Now, with the unprecedented decision of Marcus Aurelius to bypass the established adoptive succession and elevate his own son to the purple, that delicate balance was threatened. The philosopher-emperor, whose stoic meditations still resonate today, perhaps saw in his young Commodus the same virtues that had guided him. Or perhaps, in his final years, battling both physical ailment and barbarian incursions, his judgment wavered, succumbing to the natural desire to leave his dynasty intact. Regardless, upon Aurelius's death, the Golden Age officially drew to a close, replaced not by immediate collapse, but by a creeping, insidious darkness that would gradually consume Rome. This was not a sudden conflagration, but a smouldering decay. The benevolent order that had defined the preceding decades began to erode almost imperceptibly at first. Rational governance, the very bedrock of the 5 good emperors' successes, yielded to caprice and favoritism. The stern, unwavering hand of justice slackened, replaced by arbitrary decrees and vindictive purges. Corruption, always a lurking shadow in any empire, now flourished openly, its tendrils reaching into every facet of Roman life, from the highest echelons of the Senate to the everyday transactions in the Forum. The once clear lines of authority blurred, replaced by a climate of mistrust and fear. But perhaps the most chilling transformation was the pervasive atmosphere of brutality. Public executions, once reserved for the gravest offences, became spectacles of imperial showmanship. The sanctity of Roman law, once a source of pride and stability, was twisted into a tool for personal vendettas. Gladiatorial games, already a brutal form of entertainment, took on an even more sadistic and personalized edge under the new regime. It was as if the empire, having enjoyed a prolonged period of enlightenment, was now willingly descending into a primal state, embracing its darker impulses. This was the Rome that Commodus inherited. Not a city on the verge of collapse, but one ripe for exploitation by a mind unburdened by wisdom or empathy. The careful calculations of emperors like Trajan and Hadrian, who meticulously managed state finances and military campaigns, would soon be replaced by profligate spending and impulsive decisions driven by ego. The disciplined legions, honed by generations of constant vigilance on the frontiers, found themselves serving a master more interested in spectacle than strategy. The dark atmosphere wasn't just a result of Commodus's personal failings. It was enabled by the very structures of power that had been allowed to fester unchecked. The Praetorian Guard, ostensibly the emperor's personal bodyguard, carried immense political leverage. Their loyalty, once a source of imperial security, became a commodity to be bought and sold. Senators, once powerful figures in their own right, found their influence waning, their voices silenced by fear, their lives constantly at risk. This was a Rome where the delicate balance between imperial authority and traditional Roman institutions was tipping precariously, weighted down by the increasing megalomania of its new ruler. The stage was not just set for Commodus's reign. It was being meticulously dismantled, brick by precious brick, to make room for his singular, terrifying vision. In this rapidly darkening Rome, the central figure casting the longest and most ominous shadow was, of course, Commodus himself. Born Lucius Aurelius Commodus, the beloved son of the revered Marcus Aurelius, he was initially nurtured as the epitome of a prince. Educated by some of the finest tutors in the empire, he was groomed for a future of leadership, expected to embody the virtues of his illustrious father. Yet, beneath the veneer of imperial education, something sinister lay dormant, waiting for the intoxicating rush of absolute power to awaken it. His story is a chilling descent from promising heir to a megalomaniacal tyrant, a transformation fueled by vanity, unchecked cruelty, and a terrifyingly potent brand of psychological instability. He would come to embody an almost theatrical sense of narcissism, believing not just in his right to rule, but in his very divinity. But no emperor, no matter how absolute his power, rules in a vacuum. Commodus's reign of terror was enabled, and at times actively facilitated, by a disturbing constellation of characters who either succumbed to his dark whims or opportunistically hitched their fortunes to his increasingly erratic star. First among these, and perhaps most tragic in his unintentional contribution to the chaos, was Marcus Aurelius himself. The Stoic philosopher, burdened by the endless demands of empire and the grief of losing many children, made the fateful decision to break with tradition and name Commodus, his only surviving son, as co-emperor, anointing him his sole successor. Whether it was genuine paternal hope or a weary concession to keeping his lineage firmly on the throne, this act opened the floodgates for Commodus's true nature to unfurl without constraint. Aurelius's death removed the last great moral compass from Commodus's life, severing any remaining connection to rational governance. Then there were the instruments of Commodus's darker will, Narcissus and the omnipresent Praetorian Guard. Narcissus, not mentioned in historical accounts as the chief conspirator, but rather a strong, athletic individual employed by Commodus, would ironically become a key figure in his demise. However, the Praetorian Guard as a whole were far more significant. Ostensibly sworn protectors of the emperor, their loyalty was dangerously malleable, swayed by lavish bribes and the promise of power. Commodus, with his penchant for extravagance and his fundamental distrust of the Roman aristocracy, often bypassed traditional channels, relying increasingly on his praetorians to enforce his decrees and carry out his purges. They became his private army, a law unto themselves, their power growing exponentially, feeding into the climate of fear and lawlessness. These were the men who would execute senators on a whim, extort vast sums, and become complicit in the empire's spiraling corruption. Finally, there were the conspirators, the individuals pushed to desperation by Commodus's accelerating madness. Foremost among them was Marcia, Commodus's favorite concubine. While her exact motivations intertwine with shifting loyalties and self-preservation, she, along with others like his chamberlain Eclectus and the Praetorian prefect Letus, would eventually reach their breaking point. These were not initially enemies of the emperor. They were insiders, enablers, and confidants who had witnessed the full horror of his disintegration. Their roles were pivotal, for it was their intimate access that allowed them to conceive of and ultimately execute the desperate plot to end Commodus's tyranny. The stage was now fully occupied, the actors in place. Marcus Aurelius was gone, his last, great, and arguably only significant misjudgment, the appointment of Commodus, looming large over Rome. From a childhood nurtured in the imperial palace, ostensibly prepared for leadership, Commodus ascended to the throne in 180 AD, initially met with the customary adulation. The populace, likely relieved by what they hoped would be a smooth transition, might have seen the young emperor as a reassuring continuation of his father's reign. But this was a superficial calm, a brief interlude before the true nature of the new ruler began to assert itself. His promised stability quickly dissolved, revealing an unstable, volatile personality wholly unsuited for the immense responsibilities thrust upon him. His descent into what can only be described as profound madness was not instantaneous, but a gradual, horrifying unfurling. Commodus began to shed the pretense of a conventional Roman emperor, embracing instead increasingly outlandish and self-aggrandizing behaviors. The most striking manifestation of his megalomania was his insistence on declaring himself a living deity, specifically the reincarnation of Hercules. He sported a lion-skin cloak and carried a club, mimicking the mythological hero, images that adorned his statues and official coinage. This wasn't mere sycophancy from his courtiers. Commodus genuinely believed it, asserting a divine right far beyond the customary veneration given to deceased emperors. He even went so far as to rename Rome Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. But his madness wasn't confined to divine claims. It manifested horrifyingly in the arena. Dressed as Hercules or a gladiator, Commodus, the emperor of Rome, would personally participate in gladiatorial combats. While emperors had attended games for centuries, none had ever stepped into the bloody sand as a combatant. This act, designed for popular adoration, was an extreme humiliation for the Roman elite. It undermined the dignity of the imperium, transforming the emperor from a revered statesman and military commander into a crude athlete, a spectacle for the mob. This behavior was not just undignified. It was dangerous, setting a precedent that deeply disturbed the Senate and the old Roman families. As his reign progressed, so did his cruelty, his executions, his purges, and his extravagance. Senators, perceived as threats or rivals, or simply those whose wealth Commodus coveted, were often eliminated arbitrarily. Property was confiscated, families ruined. The sheer scale of his luxurious lifestyle and his constant need for funds for his spectacles and self-aggrandizement drained the imperial coffers. His paranoia intensified, feeding a vicious cycle where his unfounded suspicions led to real conspiracies, which in turn justified further purges, eroding trust at every level of Roman society. His inner circle, including figures like his Praetorian prefect Perennis and later Clender, became immensely wealthy and powerful, only to inevitably fall victim to Commodus's capricious violence, often executed on the barest pretext. The pervasive fear and disgust inevitably led to dissent. Senators and other influential figures, witnessing the empire's accelerated decline under this insane tyrant, began to whisper of plots. The once whispers quickly grew into urgent discussions. The first prominent attempt on his life occurred early in his reign, a conspiracy involving his own sister Lucilla, which he narrowly survived. This incident only solidified his paranoia, deepening his distrust and leading to even more vicious retaliatory measures. The net of suspicion tightened, trapping not just real conspirators but countless innocent victims. Commodus's ever-escalating tyranny and self-deification had created an intolerable climate within the imperial court. His paranoia, once a tool for control, was now a liability, leading him to alienate virtually everyone of consequence. The conspiracy that would finally end his reign wasn't born of abstract political dissent but of raw, visceral fear for one's own life. The plot solidified in the final days of 192 AD, a time when the emperor's behavior had become particularly egregious. He had decided to celebrate the new year, not by traditional Roman rites, but by appearing in the Colosseum as a gladiator, clad in a lion skin, prepared to duel with the consuls of Rome. This wasn't merely an affront to Roman dignity. It was an active threat to the very lives of the empire's highest-ranking officials, whom he reportedly planned to dispatch with his own hand. This final, insane pronouncement was the catalyst. It pushed those closest to him, those who had perhaps tolerated his eccentricities or abetted his cruelties for their own survival, to the brink. His chief conspirators included his mistress Marcia, whose loyalty had finally curdled into terror; his chamberlain Eclectus, a freedman who held significant administrative power; and the Praetorian prefect Quintus Aemilius Laetus, the head of the imperial guard whose primary duty was to protect the emperor, but who saw the writing on the wall. These were not fringe figures. They were the emperor's inner circle, individuals with privileged access and intimate knowledge of his habits. They themselves were likely on Commodus's ever-expanding list of potential victims. The plan was simple in its audaciousness. On the night of December 31st, 192 AD, the conspirators put their scheme into motion. According to historical accounts, Marcia, serving him a cup of wine after a lavish banquet, slipped poison into his drink. The initial attempt, however, did not prove immediately fatal. Commodus, weakened by drink and a hearty meal, felt unwell and perhaps even vomited, managing to survive the dose. The conspirators, now in a heightened state of panic, knew they could not afford to fail. Their lives depended on Commodus's immediate demise. It was at this critical juncture that Narcissus was brought into the plot. Not the mythical figure, but a strong, athletic individual, often described by historians as Commodus's wrestling partner or personal trainer. He was summoned, not to aid the ailing emperor, but to finish him. The scene that followed is one of Rome's most infamous and darkly ironic deaths. Commodus, disoriented and perhaps still feeling the effects of the poison, was in his bath chamber, a place of luxury, purification, and vulnerability. Narcissus entered, and there, in the very waters Commodus used for comfort and grandiosity, he strangled the self-proclaimed god. It was a brutal, intimate act, a far cry from the spectacular public deaths Commodus so delighted in inflicting. His end was ignoble, undignified, and strikingly personal. The death of Commodus did not bring peace. Instead, it detonated a powder keg of buried tensions. Narcissus, the Praetorian Guard, and the conspirators immediately moved to consolidate power. The Senate, having lived under a decade of terror, celebrated the news, issuing decrees to condemn Commodus's memory, pulling down his statues, and effacing his name from public records. But this euphoria was short-lived. The conspirators, in their haste to secure a successor, elevated Publius Helvius Pertinax, an old and respected senator and former consul, to the throne. But Pertinax's rule was tenuous, reliant on the volatile Praetorian Guard who had now effectively tasted the blood of an emperor. His brief, chaotic reign lasted a mere 86 days before he too was murdered by the same guard, whose loyalty was now openly for sale to the highest bidder. Commodus's death, rather than ushering in a new era of stability, flung Rome headlong into a period of unprecedented civil war and imperial instability, known as the Year of the Five Emperors, and ultimately the crisis of the 3rd century. The dramatic, ignoble death of Commodus left a gaping power vacuum and flung Rome into immediate chaos. But a modern understanding of his reign and his unique brand of madness doesn't solely rely on the single, terrifying event of his strangulation. Our knowledge is pieced together from various fragments of historical and archaeological evidence, each carrying its own biases and interpretations. The primary historical accounts that chronicle Commodus's reign are largely found in the works of 3 ancient historians, Cassius Dio, Herodian, and the Historia Augusta. Dio, a senator and contemporary of Commodus, eventually compiled his Roman history, providing a first-hand, though understandably biased, perspective. His close proximity to imperial power meant he likely witnessed many of the events he describes or heard them directly from participants. However, given the precarious nature of life under Commodus and Dio's own position within the Senate, his narrative is colored by a profound dislike and condemnation of the emperor. Herodian, writing slightly later, offers another account in his history of the Roman Empire since Marcus Aurelius. While less detailed and perhaps more prone to rhetorical exaggeration than Dio, Herodian nonetheless paints a consistent picture of Commodus's erratic behavior. Finally, the Historia Augusta, a collection of imperial biographies dating from possibly the late 4th century AD, is notoriously unreliable, a patchwork of historical fact, invention, and gossip. Yet, even amidst its questionable authenticity, it frequently corroborates the more damning aspects of Commodus's cruelty and megalomania, serving as a testament to how his reputation was solidified in the Roman popular imagination. These texts, while invaluable, must always be approached with critical eyes, acknowledging their authors' agendas and the inherent difficulty of objective reporting in such a volatile era. Beyond written accounts, tangible artifacts offer chilling confirmation of Commodus's grand delusions. His coinage, for instance, provides a fascinating, if disturbing, record of his self-aggrandizement. Emperors typically featured their own dignified portraits or depictions of traditional Roman deities. Commodus, however, often stamped his coins with images of himself dressed as Hercules, complete with lion skin and club, a direct, public assertion of his divine status. The debasement of the silver content in these coins as his reign progressed also tells a story of rampant extravagance and fiscal mismanagement, reflecting the drain on the imperial treasury caused by his lavish spectacles and personal spending. Statues, too, were a primary medium for imperial propaganda. While many were famously pulled down and defaced after his death, some survived, offering physical proof of his attempt to embody Hercules. These aren't just artistic representations. They are political statements, literal attempts to sculpt his divine image into the fabric of Rome. Modern archaeological findings, while not unveiling new direct accounts of his reign, continually contribute to our understanding of the imperial environment he inhabited. The ruins of his supposed palace, though fragmented, offer glimpses into the scale of his luxury. Research into the locations of his tomb, though his body was initially thrown into common burial grounds before being ceremonially placed in Hadrian's mausoleum, helps trace the posthumous efforts to erase or reclaim his tainted memory. Furthermore, contemporary forensic and historical interpretations by scholars continue to re-evaluate the nature of his perceived insanity. Was it genetically predisposed mental illness? A severe personality disorder exacerbated by absolute power and trauma? Or simply profound moral corruption coupled with a reckless disregard for tradition? These ongoing discussions refine our understanding, moving beyond simple epithets of madman to explore the complex interplay of character, power, and pathology that ultimately led to his downfall. The whispers of the past, gleaned from ancient texts and material artifacts, consistently paint a picture of Commodus as a destructive force. But what truly solidified his dark legacy was not just his personal madness or the lurid details of his death, but the profound and lasting impact his reign had on the vast Roman Empire. His assassination did not bring about a new golden age. Instead, it plunged Rome into an unprecedented period of instability, signaling the end of an era and the beginning of a prolonged, agonizing struggle for survival. The immediate aftermath was nothing short of a political maelstrom. The hopeful reign of Pertinax, elevated by the conspirators, was brutally cut short after just 86 days by the very Praetorian Guard who had a hand in Commodus's demise. This highlighted a terrifying new precedent. The Praetorians, realizing their immense power, literally auctioned off the emperorship to the highest bidder. Didius Julianus bought the throne, a decision that would lead 4 rival generals to declare themselves emperor in various corners of the empire. This chaotic struggle, known as the Year of the 5 Emperors, though there were effectively 3 main contenders after Pertinax and Julianus, directly set the stage for one of Rome's most trying periods. This immediate chaos was merely a prelude to the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period 235–84 AD marked by civil war, economic collapse, barbarian invasions, and persistent plague. During this time, the empire saw no less than 26 legitimate emperors, most of whom died violently, often at the hands of their own soldiers. The internal divisions fostered by Commodus's disregard for traditional authority and his elevation of the Praetorians created a precedent where military might, rather than senatorial legitimacy or popular mandate, became the primary path to the imperial purple. This militarization of politics fragmented the empire, draining its resources and diverting attention from external threats. In the long term, Commodus's reign is widely seen by historians as the definitive end of the Pax Romana. The stability and relative peace that had characterized the preceding 2 centuries were irrevocably shattered. The careful system of adoptive succession, designed to place the most capable individuals on the throne, had been abandoned in favor of a disastrous hereditary principle. Commodus's theatrical excesses, his contempt for the Senate, and his economic policies that debased the currency severely weakened the Roman state internally. He exposed the fragility of unchecked power and the danger of an emperor unmoored from the traditional values and responsibilities of his office. His misrule did not cause the fall of Rome outright, but it accelerated its decline, making the empire far more vulnerable to the myriad pressures it would face in the subsequent centuries. For modern observers, Commodus serves as a powerful, albeit chilling, cautionary tale. His story is a stark warning about the corrupting influence of unchecked narcissism and profound mental instability in leadership. It underscores how the personal failings of a single individual, particularly one vested with absolute power, can have catastrophic, far-reaching consequences for an entire civilization. The dark allure of imperial decadence, so vividly demonstrated by Commodus's reign, forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, responsibility, and the inherent dangers when the mechanisms of accountability fail. His bizarre and brutal tenure became a grim blueprint for subsequent periods of imperial decline, a reminder that the health of an empire often mirrored the sanity of its ruler. The shadow of Commodus's reign hung heavy over Rome for decades, defining the fragile power dynamics that led to the crisis of the 3rd century. His story, however, transcends the specific historical context of the Roman Empire, morphing into a potent and enduring cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked power and the devastating impact of psychological instability at the apex of leadership. It's a narrative that continues to resonate, reflecting universal truths about human nature and the inherent dangers of absolute authority. Commodus's descent from the son of a philosopher emperor to a narcissistic, homicidal tyrant is a stark illustration of how easily power can corrupt, especially when it meets a predisposed personality. He was not born evil. He was born into a system that granted him unparalleled authority from a young age, without the tempering influences of genuine challenge or accountability. This narrative begs us to consider the environmental factors that can amplify inherent predispositions. Was it truly mental illness, or was it the ultimate expression of entitlement, exacerbated by sycophancy and the absence of any meaningful restraints? His reign serves as a powerful reminder that the mechanisms of governance, checks and balances, and a vibrant, independent elite are not mere inconveniences, but essential safeguards against the caprices of an unhinged ruler. Furthermore, Commodus's obsession with self-deification and his theatrical displays of power, from fighting in the arena to demanding worship, speak to a profound need for external validation, a desperate attempt to solidify an identity that was perhaps internally hollow. This aspect of his story reflects on the dark allure of imperial decadence, where lavish displays, personal gratification, and brutal shows of force become substitutes for legitimate governance and genuine leadership. It highlights how easily a leader consumed by ego can disconnect from the welfare of the people they are meant to serve, turning the state itself into a tool for personal aggrandizement. His legacy is also cemented in the very term crisis of the 3rd century, a period of intense turmoil that began immediately after his death. While the empire faced many challenges, Commodus's fiscal irresponsibility, his emasculation of the Senate, and his empowerment of the Praetorian Guard created a dangerous vacuum and a precedent for instability. He broke the chain of adoptive succession, prioritizing bloodline over merit, a decision that contributed directly to the subsequent power struggles and the violent, revolving door of emperors. Ultimately, his reign was a pivotal turning point, ushering in an era where the Roman Empire, once seemingly impregnable, began its long, slow decline. So, as we reflect on Commodus, we are forced to confront uncomfortable questions. At what point does eccentricity become madness? How do societies protect themselves from leaders who come to believe they are above all law and reason? And what happens when a leader's delusions manifest as widespread terror and economic ruin? History remembers Commodus as a cautionary tale, an emperor tragically betrayed by his own mind and ambition, a man whose personal unraveling almost brought an empire to its knees. But perhaps his story is more than just a historical footnote. It is a timeless mirror reflecting the enduring dangers of unchecked power and the terrifying consequences when madness finds its way onto the throne. We invite you to delve deeper into this story. What do you think truly drove Commodus to his downfall? Was it madness, political incompetence, or the corrupting nature of absolute power itself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're hungry for more dark tales from the annals of history, be sure to subscribe to our channel.